When Navy SEAL Ryan Mitchell woke up from emergency surgery, he couldn't remember his own name, his mission, or why armed guards stood outside his hospital room. But when Lieutenant Jessica Parker, a dedicated military nurse, chose compassion over protocol to help him recover his memories, she triggered a chain of events that would expose a secret so explosive it would shake the entire naval base to its core. What Jessica didn't know was that her simple act of human kindness would not only save a hero's life but reveal a truth about her own identity that had been hidden for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkways of Naval Medical Center Camp Pendleton as Lieutenant Jessica Parker adjusted her pristine white uniform and checked her watch for the third time. At 28, Jess had spent the last 6 years of her life dedicated to military nursing, and every day began the same way: early arrival, meticulous preparation, and an unwavering commitment to following protocol. The sprawling medical complex buzzed with its usual morning energy as medical personnel, patients, and visitors moved through the secured corridors under the watchful eyes of military police stationed at every checkpoint. Jess had always prided herself on being exactly what the Navy expected from its medical officers: professional, reliable, and absolutely committed to the chain of command. Her record was spotless, her evaluations consistently excellent, and her supervisors often praised her ability to maintain composure under pressure while delivering exceptional patient care. She had grown up in a military family, understanding from childhood that rules existed for good reasons and that following orders wasn't just expected, it was essential for maintaining the security and effectiveness of military operations. Walking through the secured entrance of Ward 7, the intensive care unit reserved for the most critical and often classified cases, Jess exchanged professional nods with the armed guards who had become familiar faces over her years of service. The ward operated under strict security protocols that required special clearance levels, and even the medical staff were only given information on a need-to-know basis. Patients in Ward 7 were often special forces operators, intelligence personnel, or other military members whose very presence at the facility was considered sensitive information. The smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of monitors created the familiar symphony that had become the soundtrack of Jess's professional life. She genuinely loved her work, finding deep satisfaction in helping wounded warriors recover from injuries sustained in service to their country. Each patient represented someone's son, daughter, brother, or sister who had volunteered to stand between America and those who would do it harm. For Jess, nursing wasn't just a career, it was a calling that allowed her to serve alongside the brave men and women she had admired since childhood. As she settled into the nurse's station and began reviewing the overnight reports, Jess reflected on how her life had taken shape exactly as she had planned. She lived in a modest apartment just outside the base, maintained close friendships with her fellow medical officers, and had built a reputation as someone who could be counted on in any situation. Her colleagues often joked that she was so organized and dependable that she could probably run the entire medical center if needed. But Jess was content in her role as a bedside nurse where she could make a direct difference in patients' lives. The morning briefing had mentioned a new patient arriving sometime during the night, a special forces operator who had undergone emergency surgery following what was described only as a classified incident. The details were sparse, as they always were for patients at the security level, but Jess had been assigned as his primary nurse due to her experience with complex post-surgical care and her high security clearance. She had learned long ago not to ask questions about the circumstances that brought patients to Ward 7, understanding that curiosity about classified matters could quickly end a military career. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief medical officer, had emphasized during the briefing that this particular patient required strict adherence to protocol. No unauthorized visitors, no information shared beyond essential medical personnel, and absolutely no deviation from established procedures. The patient's identity was on a need-to-know basis, and even his medical records were restricted to only the most senior medical staff. For Jess, this was simply another day of following the rules that had guided her entire military career. As she prepared for her rounds, Jess felt the familiar sense of purpose that came with knowing she was about to provide care for someone who had sacrificed for their country. She had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, her unwavering commitment to following orders would come into direct conflict with her deeply held belief that every patient deserved compassionate care. The patient sleeping in room 7 Alpha would challenge everything she thought she knew about duty, protocol, and the true meaning of service. The morning routine continued as it always did, with Jess efficiently moving through her patient assignments, updating charts, administering medications, and coordinating with the medical team. Her colleagues knew they could depend on her to handle the most challenging cases with grace and competence. Nurse Lisa Chen, her closest friend on the ward, often marveled at Jess's ability to remain calm and focused even when dealing with the most traumatic injuries and complex medical situations. What none of her colleagues knew was that beneath Jess's professional exterior lay a heart that sometimes struggled with the rigid constraints of military life. She had joined the Navy with genuine enthusiasm for serving her country, but over the years she had occasionally found herself questioning whether strict adherence to protocol always served the best interests of the patients she was sworn to heal. These moments of doubt were rare and quickly suppressed, as Jess understood that military discipline was essential for maintaining order and security in an environment where lives literally depended on everyone following their assigned roles. The call from the security desk interrupted her morning routine. Room 7 Alpha was ready for its first nursing assessment, and Jess gathered her supplies with the same methodical precision that characterized everything she did. As she walked down the corridor toward the secured room, she could see the 2 military police officers stationed outside the door, their serious expressions and alert postures indicating that this was indeed a high-priority patient. She presented her identification badge to the guards, submitted to the required security scan, and was finally granted access to the room where her life was about to change forever. The patient lay unconscious in the hospital bed, surrounded by the sophisticated monitoring equipment that indicated the severity of his condition. Even in his unconscious state, it was clear that this was a man accustomed to physical challenges and demanding circumstances. His muscular frame spoke of years of intense training, and despite the medical equipment and bandages, there was something about his presence that suggested strength and resilience. The medical chart provided only the most basic information. Post-surgical patient, traumatic brain injury, temporary amnesia, identity classified. As Jess began her initial assessment, checking vital signs and examining the surgical sites, she found herself wondering about the story behind this wounded warrior. What mission had gone wrong? What circumstances had brought him to this sterile room where his very identity was considered too sensitive to share with the people caring for him? These questions violated her training to focus only on medical needs rather than personal details, but something about this patient stirred a curiosity that she couldn't entirely suppress. The next few hours passed quietly as Jess monitored the patient's condition and updated his medical records. His vital signs were stable, and the surgical sites appeared to be healing properly, but there were no signs of consciousness returning. Dr. Foster had indicated that the amnesia was likely temporary, a result of the traumatic brain injury sustained during whatever incident had brought him here. Recovery could take days or weeks, and there was always the possibility that some memories might never return. As her shift approached its midpoint, Jess found herself checking on room 7 Alpha more frequently than her other patients required. Something about the unconscious seal drew her attention in a way that went beyond professional duty. Perhaps it was the vulnerability of seeing such an obviously strong person reduced to complete dependence on others, or maybe it was simply her natural compassion for anyone suffering alone. Whatever the reason, she felt a growing connection to this patient whose name she wasn't even allowed to know. The afternoon brought the usual parade of medical rounds, chart updates, and coordination with various specialists involved in the patient's care. Each medical professional who entered room 7 Alpha followed the same strict protocol: check the necessary medical indicators, update their specific portion of the treatment plan, and leave without unnecessary conversation or questions. The efficiency was admirable from a military standpoint, but Jess couldn't help feeling that something essential was missing from this sterile approach to patient care. As evening approached and the day shift prepared to hand over responsibilities to the night crew, Jess completed her final assessment of the patient in room 7 Alpha. His condition remained stable, but there were subtle signs that consciousness might be returning soon. Slight movements during stimulation tests and changes in brain wave patterns suggested that the period of unconsciousness was nearing its end. When he did wake up, he would face the disorienting experience of not knowing who he was, where he was, or why armed guards stood outside his door. The thought of this brave warrior waking up alone and confused, surrounded by strangers who weren't allowed to provide even basic information about his identity, troubled Jess more than she cared to admit. She understood the security concerns that necessitated such strict protocols, but her nursing instincts told her that emotional support and human connection were often as important as medical treatment in the healing process. As she prepared to leave for the day, she made a decision that would prove to be the first step toward changing both their lives forever. Instead of simply filing her shift report and heading home as protocol demanded, Jess lingered in room 7 Alpha for a few extra minutes. She adjusted the patient's position slightly to ensure his comfort, checked that his call button was within easy reach for when consciousness returned, and spoke softly to his unconscious form about the progress he was making and the care he would continue to receive. These small acts of personal attention went beyond what regulations required, but they felt necessary to Jess as both a nurse and a human being who recognized the inherent dignity of every person under her care. As she finally prepared to leave the room, the patient's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused and confused but unmistakably aware. The connection lasted only seconds before unconsciousness returned, but in that brief instant, Jess saw something that would haunt her throughout the night ahead, the look of a man who was completely lost and desperately in need of an anchor. In a world that had suddenly become alien and frightening. That single moment of eye contact would drive her to make choices that violated everything she had been taught about military protocol and professional boundaries. The following morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized military operations at Naval Medical Center Camp Pendleton. Jessica Parker stood at the nurse's station, reviewing overnight reports while the familiar sounds of the morning shift change echoed through Ward 7. The armed guards had rotated as scheduled, the night nurses provided their standard briefings. And every patient chart reflected the meticulous documentation that military medical protocols demanded. Yet beneath this veneer of routine operations, Jessica found herself preoccupied with thoughts of the unconscious SEAL in Room 7 Alpha and that brief moment of consciousness she had witnessed the evening before. Dr. Amanda Foster appeared at the nurse's station precisely at 7:15, her pressed uniform and stern expression embodying the no-nonsense approach that had earned her the position of Chief Medical Officer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Foster had built her career on strict adherence to military regulations and had little patience for anyone who questioned established procedures. Her reputation throughout the medical center was that of a competent physician who prioritized institutional security over individual patient concerns, a philosophy that had served her well in an environment where classified operations and sensitive personnel were routine matters. The morning briefing began with Foster's familiar emphasis on security protocols and the absolute necessity of maintaining professional boundaries with all patients, but particularly those assigned to Ward 7. Jessica listened as the chief medical officer outlined the specific restrictions that governed their interaction with the SEAL patient, restrictions that seemed to grow more comprehensive with each passing day. Medical personnel were prohibited from discussing the patient's condition with anyone outside the immediate treatment team. Visitors were absolutely forbidden without express authorization from command-level officers, and even routine medical conversations were to be limited to essential information only. Foster's voice carried the weight of military authority as she reminded the assembled nurses that their security clearances were privileges that could be revoked instantly for any violation of established protocols. The consequences of unauthorized information sharing extended far beyond simple disciplinary action, potentially including court-martial proceedings and imprisonment for breaches of national security. The message was unmistakably clear: personal feelings and individual judgment were subordinate to institutional requirements, and anyone who forgot this fundamental principle would find their military career terminated swiftly and permanently. The organizational structure of Ward 7 reflected the military's hierarchical approach to managing sensitive information and classified personnel. Every aspect of patient care was compartmentalized, with different medical professionals responsible for specific elements of treatment while remaining deliberately uninformed about broader circumstances or patient backgrounds. Nurses administered medications and monitored vital signs without access to mission details or operational information. Physicians focused on surgical procedures and recovery protocols without knowing the circumstances that had caused the injuries. Even administrative personnel processed paperwork and maintained records while remaining ignorant of patient identities or the nature of their classified status. This systematic approach to information control extended to every interaction within the medical facility. Conversations between medical personnel were monitored and documented, electronic communications were subject to review by security officers. And even casual discussions during breaks were expected to avoid any reference to classified patients or sensitive operations. The atmosphere created by these restrictions was one of professional efficiency combined with constant awareness that every word and action was subject to scrutiny by authorities whose primary concern was maintaining operational security rather than fostering supportive working relationships. Jessica had always accepted these constraints as necessary components of military service, understanding that the protection of classified information often meant the difference between successful operations and catastrophic security breaches. Her training had emphasized repeatedly that individual preferences and personal feelings were luxuries that military personnel could not afford when national security interests were at stake. The rigid structure of military medical care was designed To ensure that emotion-driven decisions did not compromise the safety of ongoing operations or the security of personnel whose lives depended on maintaining operational secrecy. However, as Jessica moved through her morning rounds, she found herself increasingly troubled by the impersonal nature of the care being provided to the SEAL patient in room 7 Alpha. The man lay unconscious and alone, surrounded by sophisticated medical equipment but isolated from any human connection that might provide comfort during his recovery. His chart identified him only by a numerical designation, his medical history was restricted to essential surgical information, and even his basic demographic details were classified at levels that prevented most medical personnel from accessing them. The visiting restrictions were particularly concerning to Jessica, who had witnessed firsthand how important family support and personal connections were to the recovery process. Military personnel often faced extended periods of isolation during deployments and operations, but the healing process typically benefited enormously from contact with loved ones who could provide emotional support and motivation during difficult recovery periods. The complete prohibition on visitors for the SEAL patient meant that he would face his recovery entirely alone, without the comfort of familiar voices or the reassurance of people who cared about his well-being beyond his military utility. Dr. Foster's approach to the SEAL patient exemplified the institutional mindset that prioritized security considerations over individual patient needs. During her brief visits to room 7 Alpha, Foster focused exclusively on medical indicators and treatment protocols, showing no interest in the patient as a person beyond his value as a classified asset requiring protection. Her interactions were clinical and efficient, designed to gather necessary medical information while maintaining the emotional distance that military protocols demanded. There was no acknowledgement of the patient's humanity, no recognition of his sacrifice in service to his country, and certainly no consideration of his emotional or psychological needs during the recovery process. The nursing staff had been explicitly instructed to limit their interactions with the SEAL patient to essential medical procedures and basic comfort measures. Conversations were to be kept to the minimum necessary for providing care, personal questions were absolutely prohibited, and any attempt to gather information about his background or circumstances would be treated as a serious security violation. These restrictions created an environment where the patient would essentially be treated as a medical specimen rather than a human being deserving of compassion and understanding during a vulnerable period of his life. Jessica's experience with other military patients had taught her that psychological support and human connection were often as important as medical treatment in determining recovery outcomes. Warriors who had dedicated their lives to protecting others typically responded positively to caregivers who recognized their sacrifice and treated them with the respect and dignity their service had earned. The strict protocols governing the SEAL patient's care eliminated these important elements of healing, creating a sterile environment that addressed his physical needs while ignoring the emotional and psychological aspects of recovery. The medication schedule for the SEAL patient had been carefully designed to manage pain and prevent complications while maintaining the level of unconsciousness that simplified security concerns. Jessica noticed that the prescribed dosages seemed higher than typically necessary for someone with his injury profile, suggesting that medical decisions were being influenced by security considerations rather than purely medical factors. The prolonged unconsciousness made it easier to maintain information security but potentially complicated the recovery process by delaying the natural healing mechanisms that consciousness typically facilitated. As Jessica administered the morning medications and completed her assessment of the patient's condition, she observed subtle signs that consciousness was attempting to return despite the pharmaceutical intervention. Brainwave patterns showed increased activity during certain periods, muscle responses indicated improving neurological function, and vital signs suggested that his body was recovering more rapidly than the treatment protocol seemed designed to accommodate. These observations raised uncomfortable questions about whether medical decisions were being made in the patient's best interests or primarily to serve institutional security requirements. The isolation protocols extended beyond restricting visitors to include limitations on the type and extent of medical information that could be shared with the patient himself once consciousness returned. Standard practice would typically involve explaining his condition, discussing his prognosis, and providing reassurance about his recovery prospects, but the classified nature of his situation meant that even basic medical communication would be severely constrained. He would wake up in an environment where the people caring for him were prohibited from answering fundamental questions about his identity, his location, or the circumstances that had brought him to the medical facility. Jessica found herself imagining the confusion and fear that would accompany the patient's return to consciousness under these circumstances. Military personnel were trained to assess situations quickly and gather information necessary for understanding their operational environment, but the security restrictions would prevent him from obtaining even basic orientating information. He would be completely dependent on medical personnel who were forbidden from providing the reassurance and explanation that any patient deserved, creating a situation that seemed designed to increase anxiety and impede the recovery process. The shift supervisor, Commander Stevens, appeared at the nurse's station during the mid-morning rounds to review patient status reports and ensure that all protocols were being followed correctly. His inspection of the documentation for Room 7 Alpha was particularly thorough, reflecting the heightened scrutiny that accompanied any classified patient assignment. Stevens emphasized that any deviation from established procedures would result in immediate investigation and potential disciplinary action, making it clear that creative interpretations of protocol would not be tolerated under any circumstances. During lunch break, Jessica found herself in conversation with Nurse Lisa Chen, her closest friend among the medical staff and someone whose judgment she trusted implicitly. Chen had several years of experience with classified patients and understood both the importance of security protocols and the human cost of treating warriors as institutional assets rather than individuals deserving of compassion. Their discussion touched carefully on the challenges of providing quality medical care within the constraints of military security requirements, a topic that required delicate navigation to avoid any appearance of questioning established authority. Chen shared her observation that classified patients often experienced longer recovery times and higher rates of psychological complications compared to standard military patients, outcomes that seemed correlated with the isolation and depersonalization that security protocols typically imposed. While she was careful not to directly criticize established procedures, her comments suggested that the current approach to managing classified patients might not serve their long-term interests or support optimal recovery outcomes. These insights reinforced Jessica's growing concern that institutional priorities were not aligned with the best interests of the patient under her care. The afternoon brought a series of high-ranking medical officers to Ward 7 for what was described as a routine inspection but felt more like an investigation into the handling of the classified patient. Jessica observed these officials examining documentation, questioning staff members, and reviewing security procedures with an intensity that suggested concerns about potential protocol violations. The atmosphere of scrutiny created additional pressure on medical personnel to demonstrate absolute compliance with established procedures, further emphasizing the priority placed on institutional security over individual patient welfare. As the day progressed, Jessica became increasingly aware of the contradiction between her professional training as a nurse and the constraints imposed by military security requirements. Her education had emphasized the importance of treating patients as whole human beings whose emotional and psychological needs were integral to the healing process. The military protocols governing classified patients seemed designed to eliminate precisely those elements of care that her training had identified as essential for optimal recovery outcomes. The evening shift change approached with Jessica feeling more conflicted than she had ever experienced during her military career. The patient in Room 7 Alpha remained unconscious, but medical indicators suggested that consciousness would return soon, possibly within the next 24 hours. When that moment arrived, he would face the disorienting experience of waking up in a medical facility where the people caring for him were prohibited from providing basic information about his identity or circumstances, creating a situation that seemed guaranteed to increase trauma rather than facilitate healing. The third day of Ryan Mitchell's hospitalization began with subtle changes that Jessica Parker noticed immediately during her morning assessment. His brainwave patterns showed increased activity during REM cycles, his responses to stimulation were becoming more pronounced, and his vital signs indicated that the enforced unconsciousness was giving way to natural sleep patterns. The medications that had kept him sedated were being metabolized more efficiently by his recovering system, and despite the carefully calibrated dosages designed to maintain unconsciousness, his body was fighting to return to awareness. Jessica stood beside his bed, monitoring the various displays that tracked his neurological function while observing the almost imperceptible movements that suggested consciousness was attempting to surface. His fingers would occasionally flex in response to some internal stimulus, his eyes moved beneath closed lids with increasing frequency, and his breathing patterns had shifted from the deep, regular rhythm of medicated sleep to the more variable cadence of natural rest. These signs were encouraging from a medical standpoint, indicating that his brain injury was healing and normal function was returning, but they also meant that the period of comfortable unconsciousness was rapidly ending. The morning medical rounds had included Dr. Foster's customary brief examination, during which she noted the improving neurological indicators with professional satisfaction while expressing concern about the complications that consciousness would introduce to the security protocol. Once the patient became aware of his surroundings, maintaining information security would become significantly more challenging, requiring constant vigilance to prevent unauthorized questions or attempts to gather classified information. Foster had instructed the nursing staff to notify her immediately when consciousness returned, emphasizing that the patient's first moments of awareness would be critical for establishing the boundaries that would govern all future interactions. Jessica had received specific instructions about managing the patient's initial period of consciousness, instructions that troubled her more than she cared to acknowledge. She was to provide only essential medical information, deflect any personal questions, and immediately summon security personnel if the patient became agitated or demanding. Under no circumstances was she to reveal his identity, discuss his location beyond general medical facility designation, or provide information about the circumstances that had brought him to Ward 7. These restrictions meant that his first conscious moments would be characterized by confusion and isolation rather than the reassurance and support that recovery typically required. As the morning progressed, Jessica found herself checking room 7 Alpha more frequently than her other patients required, drawn by an inexplicable sense that consciousness was imminent. Her nursing instincts, developed through years of observing patient recovery patterns, suggested that the critical moment was approaching when Ryan Mitchell would transition from unconscious patient to aware individual facing a bewildering situation that protocol prevented her from adequately addressing. The anticipation created a tension that she struggled to conceal from her colleagues, who might interpret her heightened attention as inappropriate personal interest in a classified patient. The moment arrived during the early afternoon shift, when Jessica entered room 7 Alpha for what she expected to be a routine vital signs check. Ryan's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with the unfocused confusion of someone emerging from deep unconsciousness. His breathing had quickened slightly, and his heart rate showed the elevated pattern typical of patients experiencing disorientation upon awakening in unfamiliar medical environments. As Jessica approached his bed, his eyes tracked toward her movement with obvious effort, seeking some anchor of understanding in a world that had suddenly become foreign and incomprehensible. The first words he spoke were barely audible, a hoarse whisper that reflected both his physical condition and the disorientation that accompanied his return to consciousness. He asked the most fundamental question that any awakening patient would pose: who was he, and where was he? The simplicity of the questions made the complexity of the required response even more painful for Jessica, who found herself faced with the impossible task of providing comfort while withholding the basic information that any conscious person deserved to know about their situation. Following her instructions, Jessica introduced herself by rank and position while explaining that he was in a military medical facility receiving treatment for injuries sustained during military operations. She provided reassurance about his medical condition and prognosis while carefully avoiding any specific details about his identity or the circumstances that had brought him to Ward 7. The frustration in his eyes as he processed this limited information was evident, but protocol prevented her from offering the additional explanation that his obvious confusion demanded. Ryan's attempts to remember his own identity were heartbreaking to witness. Jessica observed him struggle with the fundamental disorientation of amnesia, the terrifying experience of awakening to discover that his most basic sense of self had been erased by trauma. He examined his hands as if they belonged to a stranger, touched his face to confirm his physical existence, and stared at his reflection in the bedside mirror with the confusion of someone encountering an unknown person. The medical chart identified this condition as temporary post-traumatic amnesia, but the clinical terminology provided no comfort for the human being experiencing the loss of everything that had previously defined his existence. The security protocols became immediately evident to Ryan as he noticed the armed guards stationed outside his room and the restricted access procedures that governed every person entering his medical space. His military training, though temporarily inaccessible through conscious memory, had created instinctive responses that recognized the security apparatus surrounding him. He understood intuitively that his situation involved classified elements, but the amnesia prevented him from understanding why such precautions were necessary or what role he played in operations requiring such extreme security measures. Jessica found herself walking a delicate line between providing appropriate medical care and maintaining the information restrictions that governed her interactions with Ryan. Her nursing training emphasized the importance of patient education and psychological support during recovery, but the military protocol severely limited her ability to address his emotional needs or provide the reassurance that his obvious confusion demanded. She could monitor his vital signs, administer medications, and ensure his physical comfort, but she was prohibited from offering the human connection that would typically be integral to recovery from traumatic injury. The afternoon brought Dr. Foster to room 7 Alpha for her first direct interaction with the conscious patient. Her approach was clinically efficient, focusing on neurological assessments and cognitive function tests while maintaining the emotional distance that security protocols required. Foster explained Ryan's medical condition in general terms, describing the traumatic brain injury and associated amnesia while carefully avoiding any reference to his identity or operational background. Her professional demeanor provided no comfort. For his obvious confusion, treating him as a medical case study rather than a human being struggling with fundamental questions about his existence. Ryan's questions became more specific as his cognitive function continued to improve throughout the afternoon. He wanted to know about his family, his background, his military service record, and the specific circumstances that had resulted in his current condition. Each question was met with the same response. Such information was classified and would be provided by appropriate personnel when security considerations permitted disclosure. The repetitive nature of these non-answers clearly frustrated him. But protocol prevented medical personnel from acknowledging his emotional needs or providing alternative sources of comfort. The isolation that security requirements imposed became increasingly evident as Ryan requested contact with friends, family members, or military colleagues who might provide information about his identity and background. Jessica was required to explain that visitor access was restricted pending security clearance procedures, but she could not provide any timeline for when such contact might be permitted or even confirm that such contacts would eventually be authorized. This uncertainty created additional anxiety for a patient already struggling with the disorientation of memory loss and the confusion of awakening in an environment where basic questions could not be answered. As evening approached, Jessica observed Ryan becoming increasingly agitated by the restrictions and limitations that governed his situation. His military training created expectations of direct communication and clear information about operational circumstances, but the security protocols prevented anyone from meeting these reasonable expectations. He began testing the boundaries of his confinement, requesting permission to contact his chain of command, asking for access to his personnel file, and demanding explanations for the extraordinary security measures that surrounded his medical care. The nursing staff had been instructed to document any unusual behavior or attempts to gather unauthorized information, creating an additional layer of surveillance that further isolated Ryan from normal human interaction. Jessica found herself in the uncomfortable position of monitoring his emotional state while being prohibited from addressing the underlying causes of his distress. Her documentation requirements meant that expressions of frustration or confusion about his situation became part of his official medical record, potentially affecting future decisions about his care and security status. The evening medication schedule included sedatives designed to manage anxiety and promote rest, but Jessica noticed that Ryan was resistant to taking medications whose purpose and effects had not been adequately explained to him. His military training had undoubtedly emphasized the importance of maintaining alertness and cognitive function in uncertain situations, making him naturally suspicious of pharmaceutical interventions that might compromise his ability to assess and respond to potential threats. This resistance created additional challenges for medical personnel who needed to balance his legitimate concerns about medication effects with the institutional requirement to maintain compliance with prescribed treatment protocols. As the day shift ended, Jessica completed her documentation while struggling with growing concerns about the psychological impact of the security restrictions on Ryan's recovery process. Her nursing education had emphasized the importance of treating patients as complete human beings whose emotional and psychological needs were integral to physical healing, but the military protocol seemed designed to address only the medical aspects of his condition while ignoring the human elements that were typically essential for optimal recovery outcomes. The final moments of her shift were spent observing Ryan as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling while obviously struggling with questions that no one was authorized to answer. His eyes reflected the frustration and confusion of someone trapped in a situation beyond his understanding, surrounded by people who were prohibited from providing the basic human connection that any recovering patient deserved. Jessica recognized that the next several days would be critical for his psychological adjustment to the constraints that governed his situation, but protocol prevented her from offering the support and reassurance that her professional judgment identified as essential for his well-being. The fourth morning of Ryan Mitchell's conscious recovery brought Jessica Parker face to face with the most challenging ethical conflict of her military career. As she entered room 7 Alpha for the morning assessment, she found Ryan sitting up in bed, his eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and barely controlled frustration that spoke to his growing awareness of the extraordinary constraints governing his situation. His physical recovery was progressing remarkably well, with neurological function improving steadily and vital signs indicating robust healing, but his psychological state was deteriorating as the reality of his isolation became increasingly apparent. Ryan had spent much of the night attempting to piece together fragments of memory that occasionally surfaced from his damaged consciousness, brief glimpses of training exercises, mission preparations, and camaraderie with fellow service members whose faces he could almost but not quite recall. These partial memories created additional torment, offering tantalizing hints of his identity and background while remaining frustratingly incomplete and inaccessible to his conscious mind. He described these experiences to Jessica during her morning rounds, desperately seeking any confirmation or additional information that might help reconstruct his lost sense of self. The protocols governing Jessica's responses to such requests were unambiguous and inflexible. She was required to acknowledge his frustration while providing no substantive information that might assist his memory recovery or confirm details about his background. Medical personnel were specifically prohibited from engaging in any discussion that might trigger memory return through external confirmation, as such interaction was considered a potential security risk that could compromise classified operations or reveal sensitive information to unauthorized personnel. This restriction meant that Jessica was forced to remain silent while observing a fellow service member struggle with fundamental questions about his identity and purpose. Dr. Foster's morning consultation with Ryan exemplified the institutional approach to managing classified patients whose consciousness created security complications. Her interaction was strictly limited to medical assessments and treatment protocols, with no acknowledgement of his psychological distress or the human cost of the restrictions that governed his care. When Ryan pressed for information about his family, his unit, or the circumstances of his injury, Foster responded with clinical detachment, explaining that such matters were outside her medical purview and would be addressed by appropriate security personnel when circumstances permitted. Disclosure. The morning brought an unexpected development that highlighted the complexity of Ryan's situation and the potential consequences of the security restrictions governing his care. A chaplain arrived at Ward 7 requesting permission to visit the patient, explaining that requests for spiritual counseling had been received through military channels and that pastoral care was typically considered essential for service members recovering from traumatic injuries. However, the classified nature of Ryan's status meant that even religious support was subject to security clearance requirements that could not be expedited through normal administrative processes. Jessica observed Ryan's reaction to the news that spiritual counseling had been requested on his behalf, a development that suggested someone within the military establishment was aware of his situation and concerned about his well-being. His eyes reflected hope for the first time since regaining consciousness, as the chaplain's visit would represent contact with the military community that remained inaccessible due to security restrictions. However, the indefinite delay in processing security clearance for the chaplain meant that even this basic form of human support would be denied pending resolution of bureaucratic procedures that could take weeks or months to complete. The afternoon brought Ryan's first attempt to directly challenge the restrictions that governed his situation. Drawing upon military protocols that guaranteed service members certain rights regarding communication and representation, he formally requested contact with his commanding officer, access to legal counsel, and permission to review his own personnel file. These requests were entirely reasonable under normal military circumstances and reflected his growing awareness that his situation involved elements beyond standard medical care for combat injuries. Jessica was present when security personnel arrived to respond to Ryan's formal requests, an interaction that proved both illuminating and deeply troubling. The security officers explained that his status as a classified patient temporarily suspended normal military rights and procedures, creating a legal limbo where standard protections for service members could not be applied without compromising ongoing operations. They provided no timeline for resolution of his status, no explanation of the criteria that would govern restoration of normal rights, and no information about the specific security concerns that necessitated such extraordinary restrictions. The conversation between Ryan and the security personnel revealed the extent of his isolation and the institutional indifference to his psychological needs. When he expressed frustration about being treated as a security risk rather than a wounded warrior deserving of support, the officers responded with bureaucratic language about operational requirements and national security priorities. Their obvious discomfort with his questions suggested that the current protocols were unusual even by military standards, but they provided no indication that modifications to his treatment were being considered or that his concerns would be addressed through appropriate channels. Jessica found herself increasingly troubled by the contradiction between her oath as a military nurse and the treatment being provided to a fellow service member who had obviously sacrificed for his country. Her training had emphasized that medical personnel served both institutional requirements and individual patient needs, but Ryan's situation seemed to prioritize security considerations while ignoring fundamental principles of medical ethics and human dignity. The protocols governing his care violated basic standards of patient advocacy that were considered essential elements of professional nursing practice. The evening brought a moment of vulnerability that tested Jessica's commitment to following orders versus her instinct to provide appropriate patient care. Ryan experienced what appeared to be a nightmare, calling out during sleep with obvious distress that suggested traumatic memories were attempting to surface despite his conscious amnesia. His agitation was severe enough to trigger medical monitoring alerts, but when Jessica responded to check his condition, she found him awake and clearly shaken by whatever memories had briefly emerged during sleep. Protocol required Jessica to document any unusual behavior or potential memory recovery episodes, but Ryan's obvious emotional distress created a conflict between her reporting obligations and her professional judgment about appropriate patient care. He was clearly in need of psychological support and reassurance, but providing such care would require acknowledging the content of his nightmare and potentially discussing memories that security protocols classified as unauthorized information. The institutional requirements placed Jessica in the impossible position of choosing between following orders and providing appropriate nursing care to a patient in obvious distress. Ryan's request for basic comfort during this vulnerable moment was heartbreakingly simple. He asked Jessica to stay with him for a few minutes while he regained emotional equilibrium, a request that any civilian patient would expect to have honored without question. However, the security protocols governing his care specified that medical personnel should limit their time in his room to essential procedures and avoid extended personal interaction that might create opportunities for unauthorized information sharing. The restriction meant that Jessica was required to leave him alone with his distress, despite her professional assessment that human support was medically appropriate and necessary. The incident forced Jessica to confront the reality that institutional priorities were fundamentally incompatible with the patient-centered care that defined her professional identity. Her nursing education had emphasized repeatedly that healing involved more than medical procedures, requiring emotional support, human connection, and advocacy for patient well-being. The military protocols governing Ryan's care eliminated precisely those elements of nursing practice that her training had identified as essential for optimal recovery outcomes, creating a situation where following orders meant providing substandard care to a fellow service member. As Jessica completed her shift documentation, she struggled with the knowledge that her compliance with security protocols was contributing to the psychological isolation of a wounded warrior who deserved better treatment from the military establishment. He had served faithfully. Her written reports captured vital signs and medical indicators while omitting any reference to his obvious emotional distress or the human cost of the restrictions that governed his care. The sanitized documentation reflected institutional priorities while ignoring the reality of a service member's suffering in isolation. The late evening brought an unexpected conversation with Nurse Lisa Chen, who had observed Jessica's growing distress about the ethical conflicts inherent in Ryan's care. Chen's experience with classified patients had taught her that the current protocols often produced negative outcomes for service members who needed support during vulnerable recovery periods. Her carefully worded observations suggested that the institutional approach to managing classified patients prioritized security concerns while accepting significant human costs that were rarely acknowledged in official assessments of policy effectiveness. Chen shared her observation that classified patients typically experienced longer recovery times, higher rates of psychological complications, and greater difficulty reintegrating with military service compared to wounded warriors who received standard care. While she was careful not to directly criticize established procedures, her comments implied that the current approach might not serve long-term military interests or support optimal outcomes for service members who had sacrificed for their country. These insights reinforced Jessica's growing conviction that protocol compliance was not necessarily equivalent to appropriate patient care. The final moments of Jessica's shift were spent standing outside room 7 Alpha, observing Ryan through the doorway as he lay awake staring at the ceiling. His isolation was complete and absolute, surrounded by people who were prohibited from providing the human connection that any recovering patient deserved. Jessica recognized that her next decision would define not only her military career but also her integrity as a healthcare professional sworn to advocate for patient well-being regardless of institutional constraints that prioritized security over human dignity. The fifth day of Ryan Mitchell's recovery dawned with Jessica Parker standing at a crossroads between military obedience and professional conscience. As she prepared for her morning shift, the weight of watching a fellow service member suffer in isolation had become unbearable, challenging everything she believed about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of military service. The night had been restless, filled with thoughts about Ryan's nightmare and his simple request for human comfort that protocol had forced her to deny, creating a moral crisis that threatened to shatter her faith in the system she had served faithfully for 6 years. Jessica arrived at Ward 7 earlier than usual, using the quiet pre-shift period to observe Ryan through the window of room 7 Alpha. He was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands, the posture of a man struggling with demons that no one was authorized to help him face. His physical recovery continued to progress remarkably well, but his psychological state showed increasing signs of deterioration that concerned Jessica both as a nurse and as a fellow human being witnessing unnecessary suffering. The morning briefing included Dr. Foster's customary emphasis on maintaining security protocols, but Jessica noticed additional tension in the chief medical officer's demeanor that suggested concerns about Ryan's psychological stability. Foster mentioned that sleep disturbances and emotional episodes were becoming more frequent, requiring increased monitoring and documentation of any unusual behavior or potential memory recovery incidents. The briefing made clear that institutional priorities remained focused on information security rather than patient well-being, despite mounting evidence that the current approach was causing psychological harm. As Jessica began her morning rounds, she found herself moving through routine procedures while wrestling with a decision that would fundamentally alter her military career. Her training as a nurse emphasized patient advocacy and the professional obligation to provide care that served patient interests rather than institutional convenience. Ryan's situation represented a clear conflict between these professional responsibilities and military protocols that prioritized security considerations over individual well-being, forcing Jessica to choose between compliance and conscience. The moment of decision arrived during her first direct interaction with Ryan that morning. As she entered room 7 Alpha to conduct vital signs assessment, she found him staring out the window with obvious longing for connection to the world beyond his restricted medical environment. His greeting was polite but subdued, reflecting the emotional exhaustion of someone who had spent days struggling with unanswerable questions and unmet needs for basic human support during a vulnerable period of recovery. Ryan's request was simple and heartbreaking in its fundamental humanity. He asked Jessica to tell him something, anything, about who he was before the injury that had erased his memory and isolated him from everything that had previously given his life meaning. He wasn't seeking classified information or operational details, just basic personal information that would help him understand his identity and purpose as a human being rather than a medical case number in a classified ward. The institutional response to such requests was unambiguous: deflect, redirect, and summon security personnel if the patient became agitated or demanding. Jessica had followed these protocols faithfully for 4 days, watching Ryan's frustration and despair grow with each non-answer and bureaucratic deflection. But standing in room 7 Alpha on the 5th morning, faced with a fellow service member's desperate need for basic human connection, Jessica made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of providing the standard deflection about classified information and security protocols, Jessica pulled a chair beside Ryan's bed and spoke to him as one service member to another. She began by acknowledging his frustration and validating his need for information about his identity, explaining that while she couldn't provide specific details about his background, she could offer general observations about the kind of person he appeared to be based on her interactions with him over the past several days. Jessica's words were carefully chosen to avoid violating specific security restrictions while still providing the human connection that Ryan desperately needed. She described his obvious physical conditioning and bearing as indicators of elite military training, his polite and respectful interactions with medical staff as evidence of strong character and good upbringing, and his concern for others even during his own distress as proof of the selfless nature that typically characterized special operations personnel. These observations weren't classified information, but they provided Ryan with the first positive feedback about his identity that he had received since regaining consciousness. The effect of this simple human interaction was immediate and profound. Ryan's posture straightened, his eyes brightened with hope, and for the first time since awakening, he smiled with genuine appreciation rather than polite acknowledgement. The validation of his worth as a person rather than a security concern provided psychological relief that was visibly therapeutic, demonstrating the healing power of basic human compassion that institutional protocols had systematically denied him. Encouraged by Ryan's positive response and driven by her professional assessment that emotional support was medically necessary for his recovery, Jessica continued their conversation by sharing general observations about military service and the characteristics she had noticed in elite service members throughout her nursing career. She spoke about the dedication, sacrifice, and courage that defined special operations personnel, allowing Ryan to infer connections to his own situation without providing specific classified information about his background or mission. The conversation extended beyond the brief interaction that security protocols permitted, but Jessica justified the time as medically necessary for assessing Ryan's psychological condition and providing therapeutic communication that was essential for optimal recovery outcomes. Her nursing training provided clear guidelines about the importance of addressing patient emotional needs, and she documented the interaction as therapeutic intervention rather than social conversation that violated security restrictions. Ryan's questions became more specific as their conversation continued, seeking confirmation about his military service and validation of the fragments of memory that occasionally surfaced during quiet moments. Jessica navigated these requests carefully, providing general affirmation about military values and service dedication while avoiding specific details that would constitute security violations. Her responses focused on universal aspects of military service that could apply to any dedicated service member rather than information specific to Ryan's background or operational assignments. The risk Jessica was taking became increasingly apparent as their conversation continued beyond the time normally allocated for routine medical procedures. Security personnel maintained regular monitoring of patient interactions, and extended conversations with classified patients were specifically prohibited under established protocols. Jessica understood that her actions could be interpreted as security violations requiring investigation and potential disciplinary action, but her professional judgment indicated that Ryan's psychological needs warranted the therapeutic intervention she was providing. As their conversation drew to a close, Jessica made a decision that crossed a clear line from therapeutic communication to personal advocacy for patient well-being. She promised Ryan that she would continue to check on him regularly and provide whatever support was possible within the constraints of her position, acknowledging that his situation was unfair and that he deserved better treatment from the military establishment he had served faithfully. This promise went beyond professional obligation, representing a personal commitment to Ryan's well-being that protocol explicitly discouraged. The immediate aftermath of Jessica's extended interaction with Ryan created both positive and concerning developments. His vital signs showed measurable improvement, his psychological indicators reflected reduced anxiety and depression, and his overall demeanor suggested significantly better emotional adjustment to his restricted circumstances. From a medical standpoint, the therapeutic intervention had produced clearly beneficial outcomes that supported Jessica's professional assessment about the importance of addressing patient emotional needs during recovery. However, the security implications of Jessica's actions became apparent when she emerged from Room 7 Alpha to find Nurse Lisa Chen waiting with obvious concern about the extended time she had spent with the classified patient. Chen's expression reflected awareness that Jessica had crossed boundaries that could result in serious consequences, but her friendship and professional respect prevented her from immediately reporting the potential protocol violation to supervisory personnel. The conversation between Jessica and Chen was carefully worded to avoid explicit acknowledgement of security violations while addressing the obvious risks that Jessica's actions had created. Chen emphasized the importance of maintaining professional boundaries with classified patients and reminded Jessica that career-ending consequences could result from even well-intentioned deviations from established protocols. Her concern was genuine and reflected understanding of both the institutional realities that governed their work environment and the personal costs that Jessica might face for prioritizing patient advocacy over security compliance. Jessica's response to Chen's warnings revealed the depth of her commitment to providing appropriate patient care regardless of institutional constraints. The therapeutic breakthrough Jessica had achieved with Ryan Mitchell created a momentum that she found impossible to ignore, despite the growing risks to her military career. Over the following days, her interactions with him evolved from strictly medical procedures to genuine therapeutic communication that addressed his psychological needs alongside his physical recovery. Each conversation built upon the previous one, providing Ryan with increasing stability and hope while simultaneously deepening Jessica's commitment to his well-being regardless of institutional constraints. Jessica began incorporating extended therapeutic sessions into Ryan's daily care routine, justifying the time as necessary medical intervention for addressing post-traumatic stress symptoms and adjustment difficulties related to his amnesia. Her nursing documentation carefully framed these interactions as evidence-based therapeutic communication designed to support optimal recovery outcomes, using professional terminology that obscured the personal nature of the support she was providing. The medical rationale was legitimate, as psychological intervention was clearly indicated for a patient experiencing memory loss and institutional isolation. During these sessions, Jessica employed techniques from her psychiatric nursing training. to help Ryan process his fragmented memories and develop coping strategies for managing the uncertainty surrounding his identity. She guided him through relaxation exercises that reduced anxiety, taught him mindfulness techniques that helped manage frustration with his restricted circumstances, and provided cognitive behavioral strategies for dealing with the emotional challenges of memory recovery. These interventions produced measurable improvements in his psychological indicators while staying within the boundaries of legitimate medical practice. Ryan's response to Jessica's enhanced care was remarkable, demonstrating the profound impact that compassionate human interaction could have on recovery outcomes. His sleep patterns improved significantly, reducing the nightmares and emotional disturbances that had been escalating during his first week of consciousness. His appetite returned to normal levels, supporting physical healing that had been compromised by psychological distress. Most importantly, his overall demeanor shifted from despair and frustration to cautious optimism and emotional stability that facilitated rather than hindered his medical recovery. The conversations between Jessica and Ryan revealed the depth of his character and the tragedy of his institutional isolation. Though his specific memories remained inaccessible, his personality and values emerged clearly through their interactions, painting a picture of someone who had dedicated his life to protecting others and serving causes greater than himself. His concern for fellow service members, his respect for military traditions, and his commitment to duty remained intact despite his amnesia, suggesting that these core principles were so fundamental to his identity that traumatic brain injury could not erase them. Jessica found herself increasingly invested in Ryan's well-being beyond the professional obligations of nursing care. His courage in facing uncertainty, his patience with restrictions that would have driven most people to desperation, and his gratitude for the smallest acts of human kindness touched something deep within her that transcended professional boundaries. She began thinking about his situation during off-duty hours, researching therapeutic techniques that might help his memory recovery, and developing creative approaches to providing support within the constraints of military protocol. The practical expression of Jessica's deepening commitment took many forms that gradually expanded her risk exposure while providing Ryan with increasingly meaningful support. She began bringing reading materials that might stimulate memory recovery, carefully selected magazines and books about military history and special operations that could provide context for his fragmented recollections without revealing classified information about his specific background. These materials gave Ryan something to focus on during the long hours of isolation while potentially facilitating cognitive recovery through exposure to familiar concepts and terminology. Jessica also began extending her shifts to spend additional time with Ryan during evening hours when security monitoring was less intensive and other medical personnel were focused on different responsibilities. These extended sessions provided opportunities for deeper therapeutic work that addressed not only his medical needs but also his fundamental human need for meaningful connection during a vulnerable period of his life. The conversations during these sessions ranged from discussions of military values and service traditions to more personal topics about hopes, fears, and the emotional challenges of recovering from traumatic injury. The growing relationship between Jessica and Ryan created dynamics that went beyond standard nurse-patient interaction, developing into a genuine therapeutic alliance that supported his recovery while providing Jessica with a sense of purpose that transcended routine medical procedures. Ryan began to trust Jessica in ways that allowed for more honest communication about his fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future, creating opportunities for therapeutic intervention that addressed the root causes of his psychological distress rather than merely managing symptoms through pharmaceutical intervention. Jessica's commitment to Ryan's well-being extended to advocacy efforts within the medical system, as she began documenting the positive outcomes of enhanced therapeutic intervention and presenting evidence to supervisory personnel about the benefits of addressing patient psychological needs during recovery from traumatic injury. Her nursing reports emphasized the correlation between improved patient care and better medical outcomes, making a professional case for modifications to protocols that prioritize security considerations over therapeutic effectiveness. The medical evidence supporting Jessica's approach was compelling and difficult for supervisory personnel to dismiss entirely. Ryan's recovery had accelerated significantly since the implementation of enhanced therapeutic communication, with improvements in both physical healing and psychological adjustment that exceeded expected outcomes for patients with similar injuries. His vital signs had stabilized, his sleep patterns had normalized, and his overall psychological indicators showed marked improvement that correlated directly with the enhanced care he was receiving from Jessica. However, the institutional response to Jessica's advocacy efforts revealed the fundamental tension between medical best practices and security requirements that governed classified patient care. Dr. Foster acknowledged the positive outcomes while expressing concern about the potential security implications of extended patient interaction and the precedent that might be established if protocol modifications were implemented based on individual patient responses. The conversation made clear that institutional priorities remained focused on maintaining information security rather than optimizing patient care outcomes. The resistance Jessica encountered from medical leadership strengthened her resolve to continue providing enhanced care for Ryan regardless of institutional approval or support. Her professional training emphasized that nurses had ethical obligations to advocate for patient well-being that transcended institutional convenience, and Ryan's situation presented a clear case where protocol compliance was incompatible with appropriate patient care. She made a conscious decision to prioritize her professional obligations over institutional preferences, understanding that this choice carried significant personal risks. Jessica's expanding commitment to Ryan's care created practical challenges that required creative solutions and increasing risk tolerance. She began using her security clearance to access medical research about traumatic brain injury and memory recovery, seeking evidence-based approaches that might accelerate his healing while staying within the bounds of legitimate medical practice. Her research identified therapeutic techniques that could potentially restore memory function more effectively than the passive approach that current protocols mandated, but implementing these techniques would require additional time and interaction that exceeded authorized parameters. The personal connection that developed between Jessica and Ryan during their therapeutic sessions created emotional dynamics that complicated her professional judgment while simultaneously providing motivation for continued advocacy on his behalf. Ryan's gratitude for her care, his obvious improvement under her enhanced attention, and his fundamental decency as a human being fighting through extraordinary circumstances created bonds that transcended professional relationships and approached genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to military values. As Jessica's involvement in Ryan's care deepened, she began to understand more clearly the broader implications of his situation and the institutional failures that had created his current circumstances. The protocols governing classified patient care appeared to be based on theoretical security concerns rather than practical experience with recovery outcomes, creating systematic approaches that prioritized abstract institutional interests over concrete individual needs. Ryan's case demonstrated clearly that current protocols were not only unnecessarily harsh but also counterproductive from both medical and security perspectives. The evening conversations between Jessica and Ryan became increasingly personal. As his trust in her grew and his psychological stability improved through their ongoing therapeutic relationship, he shared fragments of recovered memories, fears about his unknown future, and appreciation for the human connection that she provided during his isolation from everything that had previously given his life meaning. These conversations revealed the depth of his sacrifice for his country and the injustice of his current treatment by institutions that should have supported rather than isolated him during his recovery. Jessica's documentation of these therapeutic sessions required careful balance between professional honesty and institutional acceptability. She needed to provide accurate information about Ryan's condition and progress while avoiding details that might be interpreted as security violations or inappropriate personal involvement. Her nursing notes emphasized medical outcomes and therapeutic interventions while minimizing references to the personal connections and emotional support that were actually driving his improved recovery. The cumulative effect of Jessica's enhanced care was transformational for Ryan's overall condition and prognosis. His psychological resilience returned to levels that supported not only medical recovery but also preparation for eventual reintegration with military service once his memory and security status were resolved. The contrast between his current stability and his initial despair provided clear evidence that human compassion and professional nursing care could overcome many of the negative effects of institutional isolation and bureaucratic indifference. As the second week of Ryan's conscious recovery drew to a close, Jessica recognized that her commitment to his well-being had fundamentally altered her relationship with military service and institutional authority. She could no longer accept uncritically the assertion that protocol compliance was equivalent to appropriate patient care, having witnessed firsthand the human cost of prioritizing security considerations over individual well-being. Her experience with Ryan had revealed conflicts between institutional requirements and professional ethics that would define her future approach to military nursing. The late evening hours became Jessica's most meaningful time at work, as she spent extended periods with Ryan providing therapeutic support that addressed his psychological needs while building the trust and connection that facilitated his recovery. These sessions often extended well beyond authorized timeframes, but Jessica justified the investment as medically necessary for maintaining the progress that had been achieved through enhanced therapeutic intervention. The personal risks of These extended interactions were becoming increasingly apparent, but the positive outcomes for Ryan's recovery made them seem both professionally justified and morally necessary. The morning of Ryan Mitchell's 10th day of conscious recovery brought an unexpected development that would transform Jessica Parker's careful balancing act between compassion and protocol into a crisis that threatened everything she had worked to achieve. As she arrived for her early shift, Jessica noticed unusual activity around Ward 7, with additional security personnel stationed at access points and unfamiliar officers moving through the corridors with the purposeful demeanor that typically accompanied high-level investigations. Dr. Amanda Foster intercepted Jessica before she could begin her normal rounds, her expression reflecting a combination of professional concern and barely controlled anger that immediately signaled serious trouble. Foster's first words confirmed Jessica's worst fears about the consequences of her extended therapeutic work with Ryan, as security personnel had reported observations about unauthorized extended patient interactions that violated established protocols for classified patient care. The investigation had apparently been ongoing for several days, with Jessica's activities under scrutiny from supervisory personnel who were trained to detect security violations. The specific allegations against Jessica were both serious and difficult to defend within the rigid framework of military protocol compliance. Security monitoring had documented multiple instances of extended time in Room 7 Alpha that exceeded authorized parameters for routine medical procedures, conversations that appeared to involve personal rather than strictly medical topics, and behavior patterns that suggested inappropriate emotional involvement with a classified patient. While none of these activities constituted criminal violations, they represented clear breaches of established protocols that could result in disciplinary action ranging from formal reprimand to court-martial proceedings. Foster's interrogation was methodical and thorough, focusing on Jessica's motivations for exceeding authorized interaction parameters and her understanding of the security implications associated with classified patient care. Jessica's responses emphasized the medical necessity of therapeutic communication for optimal patient recovery outcomes, citing professional nursing standards that mandated addressing psychological needs alongside physical healing requirements. Her defense was technically sound from a medical perspective, but Foster's questions made clear that institutional priorities focused on protocol compliance rather than therapeutic effectiveness. The conversation revealed the extent of surveillance that had been conducted on Jessica's activities over the previous week, including detailed documentation of her time allocation, conversation topics, and apparent emotional investment in Ryan's well-being. Security personnel had compiled comprehensive records that painted a picture of systematic protocol violations motivated by personal rather than professional considerations, creating a case that would be difficult to defend through appeals to medical necessity or patient advocacy obligations. Jessica's recognition that her activities had been under systematic surveillance created immediate concerns about the implications for Ryan's care and recovery. If security personnel had been monitoring their interactions, they had witnessed his memory recovery progress, observed his growing emotional stability, and documented the positive outcomes that enhanced therapeutic intervention had produced. This information could be used either to support continued enhanced care or to justify returning to the restrictive protocols that had initially hindered his recovery, depending on how institutional priorities were ultimately defined. The immediate consequence of the investigation was Jessica's temporary suspension from patient care responsibilities pending resolution of the security review. Foster explained that continued interaction with classified patients was inappropriate while questions existed about Jessica's ability to maintain appropriate professional boundaries and comply with established security protocols. The suspension was characterized as administrative rather than disciplinary, but Jessica understood that her military career hung in the balance while supervisory personnel determined whether her actions constituted serious enough violations to warrant formal charges. The practical impact of Jessica's suspension extended beyond personal consequences to create significant concerns about Ryan's continued care and psychological stability. Over the past week, he had become dependent on their therapeutic relationship for emotional support and recovery motivation, making the sudden termination of their interaction potentially destabilizing for his psychological condition. Jessica's absence would leave Ryan without explanation or understanding of why the support he had come to rely upon was suddenly withdrawn, potentially triggering regression in his recovery progress. Jessica's attempts to advocate for continued therapeutic intervention during her suspension were met with institutional resistance that prioritized security considerations over patient welfare concerns. Foster emphasized that protocol violations had compromised Jessica's effectiveness as a care provider and that patient assignments would be redistributed to medical personnel who could maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The implication was clear that Jessica's commitment to Ryan's well-being had been reframed as unprofessional conduct that disqualified her from continued involvement in his care. The afternoon brought a formal interview with Commander Stevens and security personnel, who had been investigating Jessica's activities throughout the previous week. The session was conducted in an administrative conference room with official recording equipment and legal advisors present, emphasizing the serious nature of the allegations and the potential consequences of the investigation findings. Jessica was advised of her rights under military law while being informed that cooperation with the investigation would be considered favorably in determining appropriate disciplinary measures. The detailed questioning focused on Jessica's motivations for exceeding authorized protocols and her understanding of the security implications associated with unauthorized patient interaction. Commander Stevens emphasized repeatedly that classified patient care required strict adherence to established procedures specifically because individual judgment about appropriate care could compromise operational security and endanger military personnel whose safety depended on maintaining information confidentiality. Jessica's responses emphasized patient advocacy obligations and medical necessity while acknowledging that protocol compliance was an important component of military service. The investigation revealed the institutional tension between medical effectiveness and security requirements that had created Jessica's ethical dilemma in the first place. Commander Stevens acknowledged that enhanced patient care often produced better medical outcomes while maintaining that security considerations must take precedence over individual patient preferences or medical staff recommendations. The conversation made clear that institutional policy prioritized abstract security concerns over concrete evidence about therapeutic effectiveness, creating systematic approaches that could harm rather than help the service members they were designed to protect. Jessica's defense of her actions was grounded in professional nursing standards and evidence-based therapeutic practices that supported enhanced patient interaction as medically necessary for optimal recovery outcomes. She presented documentation of Ryan's improved vital signs, psychological indicators, and overall progress as evidence that her approach had been not only appropriate but essential for his successful recovery from traumatic injury. The medical evidence was compelling and demonstrated clear correlation between enhanced care and improved patient outcomes. However, the institutional response to Jessica's evidence revealed the fundamental incompatibility between medical best practices and security protocols that governed classified patient care. Commander Stevens acknowledged the positive medical outcomes while emphasizing that security requirements created constraints that sometimes prevented optimal medical care, in favor of maintaining operational confidentiality. The implication was that service members in classified situations must accept suboptimal care as a necessary cost of maintaining national security interests. The formal interview concluded with Jessica being informed that her case would be reviewed by senior medical and security personnel who would determine appropriate disciplinary measures based on the investigation findings. Commander Stevens emphasized that while her motivations appeared to be well-intentioned, protocol violations in classified environments could not be overlooked regardless of positive outcomes or medical justifications. Jessica was advised to prepare for potential consequences ranging from formal reprimand to separation from military service, depending on the final determination of senior review authorities. The immediate aftermath of the investigation created a period of uncertainty that was emotionally devastating for Jessica while potentially traumatic for Ryan, who had been informed only that his primary nurse was no longer available and that his care would be provided by other medical personnel. The sudden termination of their therapeutic relationship eliminated the support system that had been essential for his psychological recovery while providing no explanation or closure that might help him process the abrupt change in his circumstances. Jessica's suspension from patient care created practical challenges for Ward 7 personnel who had to absorb her responsibilities while maintaining security protocols that prevented discussion of the reasons for her absence. The redistribution of patient assignments meant that Ryan's care would be provided by medical staff who were unfamiliar with his specific needs and the therapeutic approaches that had been successful in supporting his recovery. The transition threatened to undo much of the progress that had been achieved through Jessica's enhanced care while potentially destabilizing his psychological condition. The evening brought an unexpected visit from Nurse Lisa Chen, who had risked her own position by coming to Jessica's apartment to provide unofficial updates about Ryan's condition and the impact of her sudden absence on his psychological state. Chen reported that Ryan had become withdrawn and agitated following news of Jessica's unavailability, with his vital signs showing increased stress indicators and his overall demeanor reflecting the return of anxiety and depression that had characterized his initial recovery period. Chen's visit also provided information about institutional discussions regarding Ryan's case and the broader implications of Jessica's investigation for protocols governing classified patient care. Senior medical personnel were apparently reviewing current approaches to determine whether modifications might be appropriate for balancing security requirements with therapeutic effectiveness, but any changes would come too late to benefit Ryan's current situation or resolve Jessica's immediate career crisis. The conversation between Jessica and Chen revealed the personal cost of institutional inflexibility and the human consequences of prioritizing abstract security concerns over individual well-being. Chen's support provided emotional comfort for Jessica while highlighting the isolation she now faced from colleagues who sympathized with her situation but could not risk their own careers by providing overt support for her actions. The discussion emphasized that Jessica's commitment to patient advocacy had created consequences that extended beyond personal disciplinary measures to affect the broader community of medical personnel serving classified patients. As the evening concluded, Jessica faced the reality that her military career might be ending because of her commitment to providing appropriate patient care for a fellow service member who had sacrificed for his country. The investigation had reframed her professional obligations as security violations, transforming evidence-based medical practice into institutional insubordination that could result in court-martial proceedings and termination of military service. The personal cost of standing up for patient advocacy was becoming apparent, but Jessica's conviction about the righteousness of her actions remained unshaken despite the potential consequences. The morning of Jessica Parker's formal disciplinary hearing arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized military justice proceedings, but beneath the procedural correctness lay a human tragedy that would define both her future and the broader implications of institutional priorities within military medical care. As she dressed in her formal uniform for what might be the final time, Jessica reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from dedicated military nurse to defendant in proceedings that would determine whether patient advocacy constituted insubordination worthy of court-martial. The disciplinary panel convened in the base administrative building consisted of senior medical officers, security personnel, and legal advisors whose responsibility was to determine whether Jessica's actions constituted serious enough protocol violations to warrant formal charges under military law. The composition of the panel reflected the institutional tension between medical effectiveness and security requirements that had created Jessica's ethical dilemma, with representatives of different military priorities tasked with reaching consensus about appropriate consequences for her patient advocacy efforts. Commander Patricia Hayes presided over the proceedings with the stern professionalism that had characterized her distinguished military career, but her opening remarks revealed the complexity of the issues under consideration and the precedent that Jessica's case might establish for future handling of classified patient care. Hayes emphasized that military medical personnel faced unique challenges in balancing therapeutic obligations with security requirements, making individual cases important not only for the personnel involved but also for the broader military medical community serving in classified environments. The presentation of evidence against Jessica was methodical and comprehensive, documenting each instance where her patient interactions had exceeded authorized parameters and demonstrating a pattern of behavior that security personnel characterized as systematic disregard for established protocols. The documentation included precise time logs showing extended presence in Room 7 Alpha, recorded conversations that appeared to involve personal rather than strictly medical topics, and observational reports describing behavior patterns that suggested inappropriate emotional involvement with a classified patient. Dr. Amanda Foster's testimony provided the medical perspective on Jessica's actions, acknowledging the positive patient outcomes while emphasizing the importance of maintaining institutional discipline and protocol compliance within military medical facilities. Foster's presentation was carefully balanced, recognizing Jessica's competence as a nurse while expressing concern about the precedent that might be established if protocol violations were overlooked based on positive medical outcomes. Her testimony reflected the institutional position that security requirements must take precedence over individual medical staff judgment about appropriate patient care. The security testimony was more damning, characterizing Jessica's actions as potential security violations that could have compromised classified operations and endangered military personnel whose safety depended on maintaining strict information confidentiality. Security personnel emphasized that classified patient protocols existed specifically because individual judgment about appropriate care could create vulnerabilities that hostile forces might exploit to gather intelligence about military operations and personnel. From their perspective, Jessica's patient advocacy represented a fundamental misunderstanding of security requirements that governed classified military medical care. Jessica's defense was grounded in professional nursing standards and evidence-based medical practice that supported enhanced patient interaction as essential for optimal recovery outcomes. Her military attorney presented documentation of Ryan's improved medical indicators, psychological stability, and accelerated recovery timeline as evidence that her approach had been not only appropriate but necessary for achieving therapeutic goals that served both individual and institutional interests. The defense emphasized that effective patient care ultimately supported military readiness by returning service members to active duty more quickly and with better psychological preparation for continued service. The medical evidence supporting Jessica's approach was compelling and difficult for the disciplinary panel to dismiss entirely. Ryan's recovery had progressed significantly more rapidly than typical timelines for similar injuries, with improvements in both physical healing and psychological adjustment that exceeded expected outcomes for patients with comparable trauma. His vital signs had stabilized, his cognitive function had improved, and his overall psychological resilience had returned to levels that supported eventual reintegration with military service once his security status was resolved. However, the institutional response to this evidence revealed the fundamental tension between medical effectiveness and security requirements that had created Jessica's situation in the first place. Security personnel argued that positive medical outcomes could not justify protocol violations that might compromise classified operations, emphasizing that the precedent of allowing individual medical staff to override established security procedures could create vulnerabilities that hostile forces might exploit in future operations. The testimony of other medical personnel provided mixed perspectives on Jessica's actions and their implications for military medical practice. Some colleagues supported her approach as consistent with professional nursing obligations and evidence-based therapeutic practices, while others expressed concern about the precedent that might be established if protocol violations were overlooked based on individual patient responses. The divided opinion within the medical community reflected broader tensions between therapeutic effectiveness and institutional compliance that characterized military medical care in classified environments. Ryan Mitchell's absence from the proceedings was notable and reflected the continued restrictions that prevented his participation in discussions about his own care and recovery. Security protocols prohibited him from providing testimony about the benefits he had received from Jessica's enhanced care, eliminating the patient perspective that would typically be central to evaluating medical treatment decisions. His exclusion from the process demonstrated the extent to which security considerations dominated individual patient rights within classified military medical care. The deliberation period extended through the afternoon as panel members wrestled with the competing priorities and precedent-setting implications of their decision. The complexity of the issues under consideration was evident in the extended discussion time and the multiple requests for clarification about specific protocols and their interpretation within military medical practice. The panel's careful consideration suggested recognition that their decision would affect not only Jessica's career but also future approaches to classified patient care throughout the military medical system. The final decision was announced in the early evening with Commander Hayes reading a formal statement that attempted to balance recognition of Jessica's positive intentions with institutional requirements for protocol compliance. The panel found that while Jessica's actions had produced beneficial medical outcomes for the patient, her systematic disregard for established security protocols constituted serious misconduct that could not be overlooked regardless of therapeutic effectiveness or patient advocacy motivations. The specific consequences imposed on Jessica were severe enough to effectively end her military medical career while stopping short of criminal charges that might have resulted in imprisonment. She was formally reprimanded for conduct unbecoming a military officer, demoted in rank with corresponding reduction in pay and benefits, and transferred to non-patient care duties pending administrative separation from military service. The disciplinary measures were characterized as necessary for maintaining institutional discipline and demonstrating that protocol violations would not be tolerated regardless of individual motivations or positive outcomes. Jessica's immediate reaction to the disciplinary decision was a mixture of devastation and resignation that reflected both the personal cost of her patient advocacy and her continued conviction that her actions had been professionally and morally justified. The end of her military career represented the loss of everything she had worked toward since childhood, eliminating not only her professional identity but also her connection to the military community that had defined her adult life. The practical implications included loss of income, housing, healthcare benefits, and the social network that had provided personal and professional support throughout her military service. The broader implications of Jessica's case extended beyond personal consequences to affect institutional approaches to classified patient care and the balance between therapeutic effectiveness and security requirements. The disciplinary panel's decision established precedent that protocol compliance would take precedence over medical effectiveness in cases where security considerations were involved, potentially affecting the quality of care provided to military personnel in classified situations. The ruling suggested that service members in sensitive positions might receive suboptimal medical care as a necessary cost of maintaining operational security. The immediate aftermath of the disciplinary hearing created additional trauma for Ryan Mitchell, who had been informed that his primary nurse had been permanently removed from his care due to protocol violations but had not been provided with details about the nature of her actions or the reasons for the disciplinary measures. The sudden and final termination of their therapeutic relationship eliminated the support system that had been essential for his psychological recovery while providing no closure or explanation that might help him process the loss of the most meaningful connection he had experienced during his hospitalization. Jessica's final days at the Naval Medical Center were characterized by professional isolation and administrative processing that stripped away her patient care responsibilities while maintaining her presence at the facility pending completion of separation procedures. The transition period was emotionally devastating, as she remained physically present in the environment where she had built her career while being prohibited from continuing the work that had defined her professional identity and personal sense of purpose. The personal cost of Jessica's commitment to patient advocacy became fully apparent during her final week at Camp Pendleton, as colleagues who had privately supported her actions were required to maintain professional distance to avoid association with her disciplinary case. The isolation was compounded by her knowledge that Ryan's recovery was suffering due to the termination of their therapeutic relationship, creating additional guilt about the unintended consequences of her actions for the patient she had tried to help. As Jessica prepared to leave military service, she faced an uncertain future without the career, community, and identity that had shaped her adult life. The disciplinary measures had effectively blacklisted her from federal employment and created obstacles to civilian nursing positions that required security clearances or military references. The personal sacrifice she had made for patient advocacy had cost her everything she had worked to achieve, leaving her to rebuild her life outside the military community that had been her home for 6 years. The final week of Jessica Parker's military career unfolded with the methodical cruelty of institutional bureaucracy, as administrative personnel processed her separation paperwork while she remained physically present at the medical center but professionally dead to the community that had defined her adult life. Each morning brought the painful ritual of dressing in uniform for what felt like a masquerade, walking through corridors where colleagues averted their eyes to avoid association with her disciplinary case, and completing meaningless administrative tasks while the patients she had dedicated her life to serving remained beyond her reach. The Administrative Processing Center had become Jessica's new assignment, a sterile environment of filing cabinets and computer terminals where military careers went to die through paperwork rather than heroic sacrifice. Her days were spent completing forms that documented her service record, processing final medical evaluations, and attending mandatory briefings about veteran benefits and civilian transition resources that felt hollow given the circumstances of her departure from military service. The bureaucratic efficiency that characterized military operations continued to function regardless of the human cost involved in her separation. Ryan Mitchell's deteriorating condition became apparent through fragments of information that reached Jessica despite the official prohibition on her involvement in patient care activities. Colleagues who had witnessed his regression following her removal from his care team provided carefully worded updates that painted a concerning picture of renewed psychological instability and declining medical indicators. His progress toward recovery had reversed significantly, with return of the sleep disturbances, anxiety episodes, and emotional withdrawal that had characterized his initial conscious period before their therapeutic relationship had stabilized. His condition. The institutional response to Ryan's declining condition revealed the systemic failure that Jessica's disciplinary case had highlighted but failed to address. Rather than acknowledging the correlation between enhanced therapeutic intervention and improved patient outcomes, medical leadership attributed his regression to expected fluctuations in recovery from traumatic brain injury that would resolve through pharmaceutical management and standard medical protocols. The dismissal of therapeutic relationship factors demonstrated willful ignorance of evidence-based medical practice in favor of maintaining institutional positions about protocol compliance. Jessica's attempts to advocate for Ryan's care through official channels during her final week were met with bureaucratic stonewalling that emphasized her loss of standing within the medical community and the finality of her exclusion from patient care decisions. Her written requests for patient status updates were denied based on security protocols that had suddenly become strictly enforced despite previous accommodation of her involvement in his care. The message was clear that her disciplinary status had eliminated any credibility or authority she might have previously possessed regarding patient advocacy. The practical consequences of Jessica's separation from military service extended beyond professional loss to encompass every aspect of her adult life that had been structured around military community and identity. Her base housing would be terminated within 30 days of her discharge, requiring her to find civilian accommodation in an expensive housing market with significantly reduced income prospects. Her healthcare benefits would end immediately upon separation, creating vulnerability during a period when stress-related medical issues might require treatment she could no longer afford. The financial implications of Jessica's disciplinary separation were particularly devastating given the reduction in rank and benefits that had preceded her discharge from service. The final paycheck she would receive was substantially smaller than her normal income, reflecting the demotion that had been imposed as part of her disciplinary measures. Civilian employment prospects were complicated by the circumstances of her military discharge and the likelihood that security clearance requirements would eliminate many healthcare positions for which she would otherwise be qualified. The emotional isolation that had characterized Jessica's final week in uniform was compounded by the knowledge that her sacrifice had failed to achieve lasting benefit for the patient she had tried to help. Ryan's regression to his previous psychological state suggested that the institutional system had simply absorbed the disruption of her advocacy efforts and returned to approaches that prioritized security compliance over therapeutic effectiveness. Her career had been destroyed without producing sustainable change in the protocols that had created his suffering in the first place. The exit interview process required Jessica to meet with various administrative personnel who documented her separation while providing mandatory counseling about veteran benefits and civilian transition resources. These sessions were characterized by professional courtesy combined with obvious discomfort about her disciplinary status, creating interactions that felt simultaneously supportive and judgmental. The counselors who provided information about veteran services were clearly uncomfortable with her circumstances while being required to provide the same level of support offered to service members separating under honorable conditions. Dr. Amanda Foster's final evaluation of Jessica's military service was a masterpiece of bureaucratic language that acknowledged her clinical competence while emphasizing the disciplinary issues that had led to her separation. The evaluation would become part of Jessica's permanent military record and would be available to future employers who requested references about her service. Foster's careful wording protected the institution while ensuring that Jessica's disciplinary case would follow her into civilian employment attempts. The process of clearing security checkpoints and returning military equipment felt like a progressive stripping away of identity and belonging that had defined Jessica's sense of self for 6 years. Each surrendered piece of equipment represented another connection to military service being severed, from medical instruments that had been tools of her profession to identification cards that had provided access to the community where she had built her adult life. The physical process of separation mirrored the emotional devastation of losing everything that had given her life meaning and purpose. The final medical examination required for separation processing provided a cruel irony as Jessica submitted to evaluation by colleagues who had supported her patient advocacy efforts but were now required to document her fitness for civilian life while maintaining professional distance about her disciplinary case. The examination was thorough and professional, but the underlying tension created by her circumstances made every interaction awkward and painful for everyone involved. The legal briefing about veteran benefits and civilian rights was conducted by military attorneys who were required to provide information about appeal processes and legal protections while making clear that Jessica's disciplinary case had been thoroughly reviewed and that further challenges were unlikely to succeed. The briefing emphasized her continued obligations regarding classified information and security protocols that would extend beyond her military service, ensuring that the institutional control that had defined her situation would continue to limit her freedom even after separation. Jessica's final night in base housing was spent packing personal belongings while reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this devastating conclusion. The small apartment that had been her home for 2 years would be turned over to housing personnel the following morning, severing her final physical connection to the military community that had been her family. The belongings she packed represented 6 years of military service reduced to boxes that would fit in a civilian moving truck. The support from Nurse Lisa Chen during Jessica's final days provided the only comfort available during an otherwise isolating and traumatic separation process. Chen's friendship represented personal loyalty that transcended institutional pressures, but even their conversations were constrained by the need to avoid topics that might create additional problems for Chen's own military career. The friendship that had sustained Jessica through her military service would continue beyond her discharge, but the shared professional context that had created their bond was ending forever. The morning of Jessica's final departure from Camp Pendleton arrived with the same sunrise that had greeted her first day of military service 6 years earlier, but the optimism and sense of purpose that had characterized her initial commitment to military medical care had been replaced by devastation and uncertainty about an unknown civilian future. The young woman who had enlisted with dreams of serving her country and healing wounded warriors was leaving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing patient advocacy over institutional compliance. The security checkpoint that had once welcomed Jessica as a member of the military medical community now processed her departure as a former service member whose access was being permanently revoked. The guards who had become familiar faces during her years of service conducted their final verification of her identity and authorization with professional courtesy that masked the finality of the separation taking place. The base identification card that had been her ticket to belonging in the military community was surrendered forever, eliminating her access to the world where she had found purpose and identity. The drive away from Camp Pendleton represented not just geographic relocation but complete life transformation as Jessica faced an uncertain civilian future without the career, community, or identity that had defined her adult existence. The military medical center that disappeared in her rearview mirror had been both the site of her greatest professional achievement and the scene of her complete institutional destruction. Her sacrifice for patient advocacy had cost her everything she had worked to build, leaving her to wonder whether the price of doing what she believed was right had been worth the devastating personal consequences. As Jessica's car merged into civilian traffic beyond the base gates, she carried with her the knowledge that somewhere behind the institutional walls she was leaving, Ryan Mitchell continued to suffer under protocols that prioritized security, compliance over therapeutic effectiveness. Her sacrifice had failed to change the system that had created his suffering, but the conviction that drove her advocacy remained unshaken despite the personal cost. The civilian world ahead represented complete uncertainty, but also freedom from institutional constraints that had forced her to choose between following orders and following her conscience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.